almost didn't hear him. The engine was still running, the heat blasting through the vents because it had dropped into the low 40s that evening, and I had my hand on the door handle already, my purse in my lap, ready to get out. We were sitting in front of my son's house on Birchwood Lane in Raleigh, the porch light on, the living room curtains glowing warm orange the way they always did when he was home. "Ma'am," the driver's voice was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it. "Ma'am, please don't get out yet." I turned to look at him. He was maybe 50, heavy-set, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a wedding ring that had worn a groove into his finger from years of being there. Not threatening, tired-looking, actually. The kind of tired that comes from a long life, not a long shift. "Excuse me," I said. I know this sounds strange. He had both hands on the steering wheel, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the house. But I've been parked on this street before, different ride, few weeks back. I remember it because the guy I dropped off, he stood on the sidewalk for a long time before he went inside, and there was a woman at the window, watching. I looked at the house. I didn't see anyone at the window. "I don't understand," I said. "That's my son's house. He knows I'm coming." "Does he?" the driver said. I didn't answer right away because the honest answer was, no, not exactly. My son, I'll call him by his name, Nathan, hadn't answered when I called that afternoon. I'd left a voicemail. I'd texted. Nothing. But that wasn't unusual for a Tuesday. He worked long hours at the distribution center, managing inventory for a regional grocery chain, and sometimes he'd go the whole day without looking at his phone. I'd assumed he'd gotten my message. I'd assumed he'd be happy to see me. I was 67 years old, and I had driven 3 hours from Greensboro to surprise him. Not just to surprise him, to talk to him. There were things that needed to be said, things that had been piling up like unread mail since his wife moved in 2 years ago, and I had finally worked up the nerve to say them. "There's a car I don't recognize," the driver said. He nodded toward the far end of the driveway, just past the edge of the garage. "Black sedan. Nice one. It wasn't there before on that other night." I looked. He was right. A black Audi, North Carolina plates, parked at an angle like whoever drove it had been in a hurry. "Could be a co-worker," I said. "Could be anybody." "Could be," he said. We sat there for a moment in silence. The heat was making me drowsy. I noticed that his phone mount held not just his GPS app, but also a small laminated card, the kind of printed-out card that people keep for reminders. I couldn't read it from where I was sitting. "My name's Wesley," he said, like he'd read my thoughts about wanting to know more about him. "I drove 18-wheelers for 22 years before my back gave out. My daughter, she had a situation, few years ago, with her ex-husband's family." He paused. I just noticed things now that I didn't used to notice. I softened. That's the only word for it. Something in my chest that had been rigid with the determination to march up those front steps and say my piece just softened. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. He thought about it. "Just wait 5 minutes," he said. "If nothing happens, you go in. But give it 5 minutes." So I did. I sat in the back of a stranger's Nissan Sentra on a Tuesday evening in November, watching my son's house, and I thought about the past 2 years. About Nathan's wife, Gretchen, and the way she'd looked at me the first time we'd met, that flat, assessing look, the kind a person gives when they're deciding what category to put you in. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself I was one of those mothers, the kind who couldn't let go. But there had been other things, small things. The Christmas I'd shown up and found that my photo, the one from Nathan's college graduation that had sat on his mantel for 6 years, had been moved to a closet shelf. Gretchen said they were redecorating. Nathan said he hadn't noticed. I said nothing. The time I'd called in March and Nathan had been strange on the phone, stilted, like someone was in the room listening. I'd asked if everything was okay, and he'd said, Of course, Mum, everything's fine. In that particular tone, that means the exact opposite. The birthday card I sent in April that he never mentioned receiving. When I asked about it, he said it must have gotten lost in the mail. I'd told myself these things were nothing. I'd told myself that Gretchen was young, 31 to his 38, and that young wives needed time to feel settled. I told myself I needed to be patient. But here I was in November, and I hadn't spoken to my son for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I had called 11 times, texted more than that. He'd replied twice, both times in short sentences that could have been written by someone else. Everything's good, just busy. That was it. That was all I'd gotten from the person I'd sat up with through fevers, whose first steps I'd photographed on a disposable camera in 1991, whose voice I still heard when I was falling asleep. Not his adult voice, but his child voice. The one that said "mom" like it was the safest word in the English language. I realized I was gripping my purse so hard my knuckles had gone white. "There," Wesley said quietly. The front door opened. A man I didn't recognize came out first. He was wearing a suit, a real one, not a sport coat, a full suit at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, and he was carrying a leather folio, the kind with a zipper. Behind him was Gretchen. She was wearing a blouse I'd never seen, and she had her hair done, which was something she only did for occasions. She was laughing at something the man had said. The laugh stopped when she reached out and shook his hand. He got into the black Audi. She stood on the porch and watched him back out of the driveway, and even from where I sat I could see her face change once the car was gone. The laugh dropped off, and what was left was something that looked like relief, or maybe calculation. Even at that distance, even in the dark, I couldn't tell the difference. She went back inside. "Who was that?" I said, mostly to myself. "That's what I'd want to know," Wesley said. I called Nathan's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. My stomach did something it hadn't done in years, that particular dropping sensation, like missing a step in the dark. "I'm calling the non-emergency police line," I said. Wesley didn't say anything. "I know how that sounds," I said. "I know I might be completely wrong about all of this, but I have a feeling." I stopped. "You know that feeling when you've been ignoring something for a long time and your body figured it out before your brain did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My daughter didn't tell me what her ex-husband's family was doing to her for almost 8 months, because she didn't think I'd believe her." He looked straight ahead at the road. "Yeah, I know that feeling." I called the non-emergency line and I told the dispatcher that I was sitting outside my son's home and that I was concerned for his welfare. I told her I hadn't spoken to him in 6 weeks. I told her I'd just watched an unknown man in a suit leave his house with what appeared to be legal documents, and that my son hadn't answered when I called. The dispatcher was kind. She asked for the address. She said she'd send an officer to do a welfare check. Wesley and I waited. "I should tell you about Nathan's father. My late husband, Douglas, Nathan's dad, passed away 4 years ago from a stroke. He was 61 years old. He was mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning in June when it happened, and by the time the ambulance came it was already too late. Nathan had taken it hard, harder than I'd expected. Harder maybe than I had, because I'd had time in those last few months to prepare for the possibility, while Nathan had not. He'd put all of his grief into action, selling the house Douglas and I had shared, moving Nathan into a new city, building a new life in Raleigh. Gretchen came into the picture 11 months after Douglas died. I want to be fair. I want to be completely fair. I was not the mother-in-law who thought no one was good enough for her son. I genuinely tried with Gretchen. I brought her things, home-baked things, a quilt I'd made, a framed photograph of Nathan as a little boy that I thought she'd like. She thanked me each time with a politeness that had no warmth in it, like the surface of a frozen lake, beautiful to look at but nothing underneath. Nathan never saw it. Or if he saw it, he explained it away. "She's just private," he said. "She had a difficult childhood. She's not close with her own family." And I had nodded, And I had accepted all of this because I loved him, and I did not want to be the reason he pulled away. But he pulled away anyway. Slowly, then all at once, the way things fall apart. The police cruiser came in about 11 minutes. One officer, young, maybe 28, with a calm face that suggested he'd done welfare checks before and knew how to handle them. He knocked on the door. Nathan answered. I saw him from the car and my chest physically hurt. He looked thin, not sick thin, just the kind of thin that comes from forgetting to eat, from running on stress and coffee. He was wearing an old Duke sweatshirt that he'd had since college, and his hair needed cutting, and he looked, in that moment, like a man who was very tired of holding something heavy. The officer said something. Nathan glanced out toward the street. He saw my car, Wesley's car. He saw me. He just stood there for a moment. Then he came down the porch steps. I got out of the car before he reached me, and I hugged him without saying anything because I couldn't. Because if I opened my mouth right then, what came out was not going to be words. He was stiff at first, that careful stiffness of someone who's been holding everything in for too long. And then he wasn't. His arms came around me, and he was 37 years old, and also 8 years old, and also the baby I brought home from the hospital in the rain in 1986, all at once, all of it at once. Mom, he said. Just that. I know, I said. I know, sweetheart. The officer stood nearby and gave us a moment. What came out over the next hour? In the kitchen of Nathan's house while Gretchen was nowhere to be found, while Wesley waited outside because I'd asked if I could pay him to wait and he'd refused the money, while the officer sat at the kitchen table and took notes in a small spiral notebook, was worse than I'd imagined, and also exactly what I'd feared, and also something I had told myself 100 times could not be happening. After Douglas died, his estate had passed partly to me and partly into a trust that was structured to eventually pass to Nathan. It wasn't a fortune, a paid-off house, some savings bonds, a retirement account, maybe $310,000 in total. Douglas had set it up carefully, had paid an estate attorney in Greensboro to do it right, because Douglas was the kind of man who thought about the future, even when the future felt far away. Gretchen had found the trust documents 8 months ago. Nathan didn't know she'd found them. She'd been in contact with an attorney of her own. Not a family attorney, but an estate planning attorney, the kind who specializes in restructuring inherited assets between spouses. She had been building a case that the trust assets should be considered marital property under North Carolina law, and that, in the event of a divorce, she would be entitled to a portion. She had been consulting with that attorney for 8 months. The man in the suit with the leather folio was not from the firm Nathan used for occasional HR paperwork at work. Nathan had never met him. The man had come to the house while Nathan was working late. Gretchen had let him in. Nathan had come home mid-meeting, and the whole thing had been explained to him in a way that was designed to sound like they were doing something together, as a couple, for their future. Nathan had nodded. He had smiled. He had excused himself to go to the bathroom. Then he had sat on the edge of the bathtub for 15 minutes, unable to figure out what to do. I didn't know who to call, he said. He was holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, and he was staring at the table. I kept thinking I was overreacting. I kept thinking maybe she was right. Maybe it was the smart thing to do. Maybe I was being, I don't know, old-fashioned. About money. You stopped calling me, I said. He looked up. 6 weeks, Nathan. I know. His voice cracked slightly. She told me that you had never supported our marriage, that you were trying to interfere. And I knew she wasn't completely right, but I also couldn't figure out where she was wrong. And every time I thought about calling you, I got so tired. I was so tired all the time. That's when the officer leaned forward slightly. Mr. Alderman, he said, Nathan's last name, my married name, Douglas's name, I want to ask you a few questions about the contact with this attorney, whether you signed anything, whether any account information was shared. Nathan hadn't signed anything, that at least. The officer made a call. Within 40 minutes, a detective arrived, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of steady, unhurried manner that comes from decades of doing difficult work with difficult people. She introduced herself as Detective Okafor and she shook my hand like she meant it. She explained that what Gretchen had done, or appeared to have done, was not necessarily illegal in all of its parts. Consulting an attorney was not illegal, but there were questions about how she had obtained certain financial documents that were stored in Dudus's trust file, which Nathan kept in a locked box that he had not given her access to. There were questions about a power of attorney form that Detective Okafor had received information about through a colleague, a form that had apparently been drawn up with Nathan's name on it, requesting authorization for a third party to act on behalf of his financial interests. He had not signed it. Someone had been planning to ask him to. These situations, Detective Okafor said carefully, sometimes involve what we call financial coercion within a domestic relationship. It doesn't always look like what people expect. She looked at Nathan. It can look like one partner making financial decisions that seem reasonable on the surface. It can look like being told your family is the problem. It can look like exhaustion. Nathan put his face in his hands. I put my hand on his back and kept it there. Gretchen came home at 9:30. I don't know where she'd been. Maybe she'd seen the police cruiser and circled. She came through the front door and stopped when she saw the detective at the kitchen table, and her expression went through several things very quickly. Surprise, then a kind of assessment, then something that settled into the particular blankness of someone who has decided to say nothing. Detective Okafor stood and introduced herself. I won't describe what followed in detail because some of it is still ongoing, and Nathan asked me to be careful about that. What I will say is that there were conversations and documents were produced, and by the time I was standing in Nathan's driveway at 11:15 that night, the situation was not resolved. These things don't resolve in an evening, but something had shifted. The lock had been found. The door was opening. Wesley was still there. He was parked at the curb with his engine off, reading something on his phone, and when he saw me come out, he rolled the window down. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Not entirely," I said, "but better than it was." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. "You should go home," I said. "You've been out here for hours." "My wife's watching her shows," he said. "She doesn't care." He paused. "Your son, he's all right." "He will be," I said, "and I meant it in the way you mean things when you stopped lying to yourself." I stayed in Raleigh for 4 days. I slept on Nathan's couch. He has a guest room, but the guest room had things of Gretchen's in it, and neither of us wanted me in there. And in the mornings we drank coffee at the kitchen table like we used to do when he was in his 20s, and I'd visit him in his first apartment. That terrible place on Elm with the radiator that clanked all night. We talked. Not about everything, some of the everything is still too raw, still too close, but about enough. About Douglas, about the last 4 years, about the ways grief makes people vulnerable and how that's not a character flaw, how it's just being human in the face of something enormous. He told me he'd known something was wrong for a long time. He just hadn't had a word for it. He'd kept waiting for the thing he was feeling to resolve into something he could name, and while he was waiting, he'd gotten quieter and smaller and further away from all the people who loved him. "I kept thinking it was me," he said one morning, "that I was the problem, that I was too attached to Dad's memory, too attached to you, that I needed to learn to let go of the past and focus on my marriage." "Was that her voice or your voice?" I asked. He thought about it for a long time. Outside, a neighbor was raking leaves. The sound of it came through the window in slow, rhythmic strokes. "I stopped being able to tell the difference," he said. I nodded. I thought about all the times I'd called and gotten nothing back and told myself not to be needy, not to be one of those mothers, not to crowd him, all the ways I had talked myself out of trusting what I knew. We had both been doing the same thing from opposite sides of the same wall. On the fourth day, before I drove back to Greensboro, I went by a coffee shop near his house and bought 2 cups and brought them back, and we sat on his front steps even though it was cold, our breath coming out in small clouds. our hands wrapped around the paper cups. "I'm sorry I stopped calling," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm going to call more." "I know that too." We sat there until the coffee was gone. A woman walked by with a golden retriever who was deeply interested in a pile of leaves. A kid across the street was doing something to a bicycle that seemed to involve a lot of frustrated sighing. The sun came through the bare oak at the edge of Nathan's yard and made everything look like a photograph from a good year. "Mom," Nathan said. "Hmm, hmm. How did you know to come? I mean, that night. You'd been trying to call and I wasn't answering. Why that night?" I thought about it. The truth was that I hadn't known. I'd just gotten to a point where doing nothing felt worse than doing something, where the distance had finally become more frightening than the possibility of being wrong. I packed a bag and gotten in the car and driven, and somewhere around the Durham city limits, I'd opened my phone and requested a ride because my hip had been bothering me and I didn't want to deal with parking. And a man named Wesley had picked me up, a man who noticed things, a man whose daughter had gone through something and who had not been there for it, and who was, I think, now doing what he could to be there for other people's families in the small and ordinary way that driving a stranger somewhere in the dark can be. "I just couldn't stay away anymore," I said. Nathan nodded. He was looking at the bare oak tree. "Good," he said quietly. "I'm glad you couldn't." I drove home to Greensboro that afternoon. It took 3.5 hours because of construction on I-85, and by the time I got to my exit, the sun was already going down. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a minute before I went inside. The house was quiet. It's always quiet now. It's been quiet since Douglas, 4 years of quiet that I've gotten used to, the way you get used to a sound being gone, the absence of it becoming its own kind of presence. But it felt different that evening. Not louder, exactly, just inhabited somehow, like something had come back in. I went inside, I hung up my keys, I put my bag down by the stairs. Then I called Nathan, and he picked up on the second ring. I keep coming back to the moment I almost got out of that car. My hand was on the handle. My purse was in my lap. I was ready. If Wesley had said nothing, if he had just pulled up to the curb and unlocked the doors the way every other driver does, I would have walked straight up those porch steps and knocked, and Gretchen would have answered, and whatever was about to happen in that house would have continued happening without anyone to interrupt it. I think about that a lot. What stopped everything wasn't anything grand. It was a tired man who noticed something and decided it was worth saying out loud, even though it wasn't his business and he had no reason to get involved. That's it. That's the whole hinge the evening turned on. I'd spent a lot of time in my life waiting to feel certain before I acted. Waiting until I was sure enough. Waiting until I had enough evidence, enough justification, enough permission from myself to trust what I was already feeling. I did it for 2 years while my son got quieter and further away. I told myself I was being respectful of his marriage, of his choices, of his right to live his own life. And all of that was true, technically, but it was also a way of not doing the hard thing, a way of protecting myself from being wrong in front of him. Nathan did the same thing from his side of it. He knew something was off. He'd known it for months. But knowing something and being willing to look directly at it are two different skills, and the second one takes a kind of honesty that is genuinely difficult to practice when you're tired and isolated and someone nearby keeps offering you an easier explanation for everything you're feeling. That's what I've come to understand about what happened. It wasn't just about money or documents or a man in a suit with a leather folio. It was about two people, my son and me, who had both stopped trusting their own perception. We had both been slowly talked out of what we knew. And the cost of that, the real cost, wasn't financial. It was 6 weeks of silence. It was Nathan sitting on the edge of a bathtub, alone, unable to figure out who to call. There's something I want to say about Wesley because I think he deserves it. He didn't intervene because he had a plan. He intervened because his daughter had once needed someone to intervene for her, and no one had, and he was still carrying that. He turned his regret into attention. He made his past useful instead of just painful. I think that's one of the most decent things a person can do, take the worst thing that happened to them and let it make them more awake to the world, not less. I'm 67 years old. I've outlived my husband. I've watched my son become a man I'm proud of, even when that man has been hard to reach. I've learned, slowly and at some cost, that love doesn't mean staying quiet to keep the peace. It means showing up on a Tuesday night in November with a coffee and 3 hours of drive behind you, and trusting that the showing up matters even when you're not sure what we find. Nathan called me last Sunday just to talk. We were on the phone for 40 minutes about nothing in particular: his neighbor's dog, a documentary he'd watched, the first cold snap of December, 40 minutes of ordinary life. I didn't take a single second of it for granted.